Hi everyone, my name is Max Slocum. I'm the Managing Editor of Tools of Change for Publishing, and I'll be the moderator today. As Catherine mentioned, please feel free to send your questions in as we go along. We will be bubbling some of those questions up as we progress, and we will also have time at the end for a Q&A. A brief biography for our presenter today, Liza Daly. Liza is a consultant and software engineer serving the publishing industry. She's been developing web applications for more than 10 years and has been a lead engineer on major XML-driven online products for Oxford University Press, Columbia University Press, O'Reilly Media, and other publishers. Currently, she's an independent consultant and the founder of 3Press, developer of the Bookworm EPUB e-reading application. She writes frequently for several blogs related to publishing and technology and is on the advisory board for the Web 2.0 Expo New York City and O'Reilly Tools of Change 2009 conferences. So Liza, I'll turn it over to you now, and welcome, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Mac. I'm actually having a little bit of technical problem right now. I'm trying to load the presentation. So if you can...
Sometimes it takes Liza, sometimes it takes a little time to convert it, so just give it a moment and don't worry about it.
I think it did flash as if there was a problem, so
Okay.
just hold on one second. I apologize.
Notice a couple folks just joined us. For those who just popped in, we're having a bit of a technical difficulty, but we should be starting the webcast momentarily. Thank you for your patience.
I believe it's loading now. It wouldn't be a technical presentation without a technical glitch.
There's always a few glitches, so I'm seeing your show start to load.
Okay, looks like I've got it here.
That's great.
Thanks all for your patience.
Okay, so thank you again for everyone showing up today, and thank you to O'Reilly Media for putting this together. I'm just going to recap some quick background for people who just joined. I am a software engineer and consultant. I've worked on a number of digitization projects whose goal was either preservation or to create online references. I've also worked on a number of XML-based digital products, mostly in the university press space, and currently I'm focusing on ebook applications, especially those using the EPUB standard, as well as general consulting for publishers. So today I'm going to cover all of the steps that you can expect to encounter in a digitization project from start to finish. I'll provide some tips based on experience in selecting a vendor to work with. After that, I'll go into just a very simple introduction to what XML is. I know a lot of publishers are aware that they need it, but they're not really sure what's involved. And then we're going to close with some inspirational bits of some publishers who have gone through this process and the products that they've put out on the market using digital content. So just some quick background. What we're talking about in digitization is going from an original document into a digital form that can be put online in an electronic product. Most of the time, we're talking about starting from a printed work, but often publishers are either starting from some kind of archive such as microfilm or even electronic documents that are in legacy systems that aren't suitable for online use. And in some products I've worked on, publishers have had both electronic and print copies, and both of those were used to inform the final online product. So for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to mostly be focusing on starting with prints. That's the normal case. And if you do have electronic resources at your disposal, that can be helpful, but it's not going to get you all of the way to an XML-based product in the end. So the three major steps that you're going to encounter in a digitization project are going to be starting with scanning, then into optical character recognition, and finally, hopefully, into XML. And from XML, you'll have a number of output opportunities and flexible ways you can take the content once it's been marked up. So we're going to go through these in detail. I'm going to start with scanning. Scanning is the process of taking a physical form, usually a paper resource, and turning that into a series of digital images. Now, a lot of people are familiar with scanning from scanning your personal family photos at home when you make a Xerox copy or send a fax. That's a form of scanning. And all you're doing is essentially creating a series of digital pictures of the original content. These pictures aren't searchable. They can't be cut and paste. They're literally just photographs of the source. But it's what we start with in a digitization project. So you're going to have two choices when you begin a scanning process. The vendor is going to ask whether you want destructive scanning or non-destructive scanning. Destructive scanning is the least expensive of the two options. Here, the original resource, usually a book, has all of the pages cut out of the binding, and then these are fed by machine in batch to be scanned. It's very similar to an office copier that can take large stacks of paper and automatically perform the copying on them. In destructive scanning, the initial resource, the book, is usually destroyed at the end. It's not returned because it's been cut out of its original source. Now, for rare or historical works, then publishers opt for non-destructive scanning. This is done manually. An individual person will stand at the scanner and turn each page as images of those pages are taken. And then at the end, those rare originals are returned to the source, usually a library or some kind of archive. This picture is actually from Google Books, and the works on Google Books have been scanned both destructively and non-destructively. And here you can actually see the hand of the person who was turning the pages, and they didn't move their hand out of the way quickly enough. And if you look around on Google Books, you can often find these kind of scanning artifacts because of the volume of material they're working with. It is possible to do non-destructive scanning in an automated way. This machine, which is by a company called Curtis, has this robotic arm that turns pages. Those two bumps at the top are high-resolution digital cameras. And as the pages are turned by the robotic arm, the camera takes pictures of each of the pages. But for most digitization projects, you will either use the destructive method by feeding the pages into a machine or non-destructive by hand. These kinds of machines are still fairly rare. After scanning, as I said, you'll have just a series of pictures, but what you really want is digital text. So optical character recognition is the phase in which these digital pictures are fed to OCR software, and that software attempts to match the pictures of the words to actual text. So here is an example of some somewhat blurry text, and the OCR software isn't always able to pick out the correct word. In those cases, a dictionary is used to spell check those words, and it can often correct some of the fairly simple mistakes, such as spelling with one L or some words that may be run together. There are going to be other cases, as you can see in this example, where sometimes the OCR isn't really close at all to the original source, and that's the role of a human being to go in and check that. So most OCR processes are going to be a combination of computer work and then some editorial checking. So obviously OCR is going to perform better when the original is very clean. If it's blurry or has coffee stains on it, it may make more errors. Another problem it can have is with works that have unusual vocabulary. So scientific works that might be in multiple languages, sometimes documents that are in an archaic form of a language. You would, in that case, work with a vendor to develop a custom dictionary that includes words that are specific to your document, and that dictionary will help the OCR make corrections. Another case where OCR could have a problem is if the layout of the document is complex. So this is a fairly simple book that OCR should not have much of a problem with. This picture is taken from Google Books, and as you can see, the fonts are fairly big and they're clear. It's very obvious what's a heading. Most OCR software can capture that some text was in italics. The only problem you might have here is that there are a number of proper names, and again, that's where a specialty dictionary or a human check might need to come in. This is an example of something that could be very hard. This is a page from the New York Times from 1918. Not only is the text very, very small, but it's in column layout. The articles are intermixed with advertisements, which you may or may not want to scan. But despite the fact that this is a very challenging type of digitization project, the New York Times has done this, and they've built a beautiful application called Times Machine, where you can explore and hover over and see the original article. You can see the OCR text there in that call-out box and read it online if you have a subscription. So this is just a quick summary of some of the parameters that will affect OCR performance. And these are things you should keep in mind when you are starting a digitization project, so you have some expectation of whether this is going to be inexpensive or something of a challenge. The other type of text that OCR may have some trouble with are going to be things like tables and equations. Tables are difficult because after the OCR has processed them, the words tend to be jumbled together. The layout of the table is not something that can be captured by OCR. And equations almost always need to be marked up by a person. So a human check on optical character recognition is another phase of the process that you can expect. And the more your content falls into one of these more difficult categories, the more important that human check is going to be. The reason this is so critical is that if your ultimate goal is to put this content online where it can be discoverable, it's very important that this text be correct. You want the words that people are searching for to actually match the content you put online. And just pure machine OCR, especially for interesting work, is not going to be good enough. So this is just a quick summary of where we've gone in this process. These first two steps are sometimes the only steps that a digitization project will go through. Mac, are there any questions before we jump into XML?
I actually had a couple of questions, if you don't mind.
Not at all.
And not to throw any curveballs here, but a couple of things that popped up as you were going along. I was wondering if you could, I'll just throw these two out there and you can address them however you want. First one, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the relationship between scanned material, web content, and search engines, just to drive home that point about discoverability. And then also,
okay.
and this, again, just sort of out of nowhere, I was wondering if you have ever heard of situations where OCR material in different languages, is that something that publishers need to keep in mind? Are there complications that can potentially pop up or nuances involved with that?
Sure. Okay, we'll start with the first one. So at the point of just scanning, there isn't much that you have available for search engines to access. Now this is actually may have just changed. Google just announced that they themselves are going to be performing OCR on definitely some kinds of PDF and probably images as well. However, their OCR isn't going to be as high quality as something that the publisher has done themselves using a custom dictionary with editorial checks. So it isn't something that you want to rely on. Second, your second question, I have already forgotten. I'm sorry.
It wasn't that good of a question. It was different languages, and this actually came up.
No, that is an excellent question. This actually did come up in one of the projects I worked on with the Arnold Arboretum, that they were digitizing a journal about plants, and that meant that a large amount of the content was actually in Latin because it was the scientific names for those plants. And in that case, automatic OCR with a dictionary can be something of a liability because you don't want an English dictionary trying to spell check your Latin terms. The same thing can happen with proper names. Spell checkers always want to turn my first name into the word lazy. So if you do have multilingual content, that is going to present a challenge. And in the case of that Latin name problem, it was a little bit easy to work around because the Latin names were always in italics. But in true multilingual content, that is going to be a real challenge and will probably require a certain amount of human intervention.
We did receive a couple of questions, if you don't mind me throwing them out there to you.
Oh, great.
Okay. First one, sec. In your opinion, what are some of the most difficult types of publications to scan? Old newspapers, old maps, those types of things?
Yeah, absolutely. The age is going to contribute a number of different kinds of problems. One is going to be just the degradation over time. That text tends to be blurry. Older text, when paper was expensive, tends to be very small. I mean, you could see that New York Times, the modern New York Times is not nearly so dense. So high numbers of characters per page is going to be an influence on OCR performance and overall cost. Certainly when you have content like maps or other kinds of inline images, then you're talking about a somewhat different kind of project where you are going to not only want to scan the pages of the work, but probably take separate high-resolution pictures of the images. And in an online presentation, those two things are often treated somewhat differently.
We've got two other questions. First one, is Google Book Search correcting its OCR that you know of?
I don't know yet. What I have seen when I've looked at it, well, for one thing, it's not really very visible to people. In a lot of projects where the OCR has not been checked by a human, it's really kept from the end user. So in Google Books, what you're reading are the scans, and the OCR content is behind the scenes driving the search. So it's a little bit difficult to know actually how good that is. And some publishers take that approach when they're not able to check all of the text by hand. They use it to drive search and present the information using the original scans. So I don't know what Google is doing. I suspect that it's almost entirely automated.
We have a bit of a technical question. Wouldn't it be possible for the scans to be batch processed through filters in Photoshop to make them clearer? And maybe if you could take a step back with that and just briefly explain a batch process in Photoshop or any type of software program.
Well, I'm not a digitization vendor, so I'm sure that they actually do some cleanup once the scans have been made. And that does seem like that could be a good approach of designing a workflow in an image manipulation software like Photoshop, tuning it to give you the kind of output that you might want. I can imagine that you would do things like enhance contrast and remove some of the dust and scratches that might be on the original. That may be something that vendors do, I'm not sure. I tend to come into these projects more or less at the XML stage.
Okay, great. Seems like a good place to go to the next section.
Okay. So, as I said, there are some projects that don't actually go all the way to XML. And although I'm going to try to demonstrate throughout this why it is something that is a worthy goal that you should get to, it's worth explaining why some publishers shy away of taking that final step to XML. So this is a very general kind of high-level graph. You'll notice there's no y-axis. I'm not providing specific numbers because it's going to be very, it will be relative to your exact project. But these are some general guidelines about cost based on the complexity of your document. And the metric I'm using for complexity is characters per page. So from that earlier example, the newspaper from the New York Times was very dense and had probably something in the range of 3,000 or more characters per page. And that very simple novel was going to be on the lower end. Most trade books are going to fall in that blue range in the middle between 1,500 and 2,000 characters per page. But what this chart is trying to show is that in an average document, to go from OCR to XML, you're looking at something like 5 times the cost. And that cost will be even greater than 5 times as complexity increases. Because you can imagine from something like the New York Times that you don't have just text, you also have photos and advertisements and a variety of different kinds of layouts that will affect the final XML. So there's a good solid financial reason why you might stop at the OCR stage, but there's going to be a lot more you can do later on if you do go all the way to XML. So now I'm just going to provide some quick tips based on my own experience for selecting a vendor to work with in one of these projects, and some gotchas that might not be apparent if this is going to be your first digitization project. So there are considerations that we've already talked about in terms of planning for cost and time are the quality of the material. Is it very old? Is it blurry? How complex is the layout? Is it a multi-column newspaper versus just a novel? Is the vocabulary in one or many languages? Is it modern, or is it specialized scientific jargon? And the other thing I want people to remember is also quantity. You're going to have a different set of problems if you're digitizing thousands of works versus 50 to 100. And some of these problems can be as mundane as how do you transfer hundreds of gigabytes of data over the net. But some other things that I feel often aren't considered up front that are worth thinking about. The first one is definitely project management. And I'm thinking both of project management on the publisher side as well as on the vendor side. On the publisher end, whoever you're putting in charge of one of these projects needs to have appropriate resources. They'll need to have the amount of time necessary to manage the project. They'll need some kind of technical resource to refer to when they want to evaluate the work of the vendor. And on the vendor side, you're going to need someone that speaks your own language, is in your time zone. Many of these vendors, or most of these vendors, are overseas, sometimes with 12-hour time differences. But the better ones will have project management local to your region. What seems like a small factor that could become a big one is shipping. Again, with vendors who are in India or Southeast Asia, can be very far away from North America or the UK. Shipping large numbers of possibly rare books can be very expensive. It's cost that's going to be passed on to you, probably with a markup. And if you've opted for non-destructive scanning, where those works are returned to you, you have to consider you're going to be paying shipping in both directions. Heterogeneous content refers to a problem that can come up when digitizing historical archives over long periods of time. So you may have a trade journal that you want to digitize the back archives for. That journal may have been published for 100 years. You're going to think of that as a single project. You're digitizing your journal. But as time has progressed, that journal's layout has changed, the fonts have changed, it may have moved from black and white to color. Early editions may not have photographs and more recent ones do. Every time your content has undergone some kind of layout change, to the vendor, that's basically a new type. And they're going to have to generate unique workflows for each of the forms that your content has taken over time. And again, that could be an unexpected cost when you think you're digitizing one thing and the vendor's really going to treat it as a number of different unique documents. And lastly, something that I feel often comes up kind of too late in the project is considering some of the unique material that might be in your work. This is especially true of reference works. If you have books that contain appendices or editorial indexes or illustrated plates, and you want to retain that material, that often needs to be treated differently than the actual text of the book. And some things like editorial indexes have the potential to be very valuable in a final online product, but they require special handling and encoding at the beginning of the project. So it's just something to keep in mind when you're making your planning. Some other tips about vendors. Before you consider any estimate, it's very important to make sure that the vendor has really seen samples of your content and at best has returned to you some work that demonstrates what they want to produce. That, especially if you're talking about XML, that's going to be possibly complex. You want to have a resource available who can evaluate whether it's editorially correct and also whether it's technically sound. You're going to want to get estimates not just about cost, but also time. Most of these projects are fairly resource and man-hour intensive, and there may be large variations in the estimated time to complete a digitization project. That's a number you should be getting from your vendor. And again, project management will be very important. You want to feel comfortable with the person that you're dealing with, that you can communicate with them well, and that you have a good sense of how the project is moving on. And many of digitization projects at their heart are very similar, so it shouldn't be difficult to get references from other publishers or libraries who may have done projects using content that's similar to yours. That way you can compare the estimated cost versus the actual cost. Did the vendor do quality output? This is going to be the best way to evaluate their overall performance. So another possibility, rather than working directly with a vendor, is to work in a partnership where you provide the content and someone else takes care of all of this work. And right now, the most obvious partner for publishers in digitization is Google. Now, the Google Books project, there's still going to be a lot of shakeout from that. A lot of publishers are wondering if it's a good idea for them. And I think that really is going to depend a lot on what your goals are, what your resources are, and how much control you're willing to give up. For publishers who may have a lot of content but really no money, I think working with someone like Google is probably a good option to get your content digitized. But if you have any ambition to do your own product development, then you need to consider whether that control loss is too much to give up. What I do recommend people think about, if you do have large backlists, some of which may be public domain, think of working with a number of groups that are interested in large-scale digitization and perform that work either with volunteers or using grant money, and then provide that content for free online. Another option could be in working with your authors to get them to agree to releasing some of their works under a looser copyright like Creative Commons. If you have the ability to put some of this content online for free, then you may be able to work with one of these groups to get some of the digitization done for free. So before we dive into the sort of guts of XML, I think this is another good place to break for questions.
Yeah, we have a couple right here. Some of these go back to some of the stuff we discussed originally. When scanning for OCR, what's the best format to save it in? JPEG, anti-aliasing, etc.?
For digital archives, I haven't worked with that deeply. I know that a lot of libraries are fond of JPEG 2000. TIFF is the most common format for totally uncompressed archives, but those files will tend to be very big. Unfortunately, sort of image archiving isn't an area I'm very familiar with.
And the other question we had, and this is it plays into some of the economic uncertainty that's going around these days. Since most conversion vendors are based offshore, have you encountered any issues with currency fluctuation affecting project budgets? I'm not sure if that's something that you've been involved with in the past, but if you have any comments in that regard.
Yeah, I tend to advise publishers, but I don't work directly in the sort of finance, and they tend to deal with the vendors directly from that perspective.
It seems like it'd be a pretty good question to ask during the vendor selection process, though.
I think so.
Great. That's what we've got. Let's go ahead on to the next section.
Okay. Now this is a very, very gentle introduction. I know a lot of publishers are often ashamed to admit that they don't know what XML is. So I'm going to make it as simple and clear as possible, and you should not have to feel embarrassed after this. First of all, just always keep in mind that XML is plain text, just like you're reading here on the screen. It's just a series of words that happen to have some additional markers to tell a computer more about how to handle that text and possibly what it means. Now, the idea of marking up text should be familiar to all publishers. This is the little paragraph symbol. It's not something that is in the final product, but it's an indicator to the typesetter or the printer that these 2 lines of text need to be handled in a certain way. They need to be treated as paragraphs. So all XML does is change the little symbols around. And if you know anything at all about HTML, you're familiar with these angle brackets. This is all that XML is. It's just some angle brackets that tell a computer something about that text. So the fact that XML is so simple is what has led to it being so popular, and that interoperability is really the key to why it's beneficial, why it offers the flexibility that it does. And part of that flexibility is the way in which you can move from one kind of XML to another. So I'm going to just quickly explain what I mean by a kind of XML, because this is a decision that you will make fairly early on in a digitization project once you've decided to go to the XML step. In your organization, especially with the IT people, you'll hear a lot of terms that are really referring to just what type of XML it is. If you're kind of old school, you may have heard the term DTD. Sometimes people will speak more generally about the format or language that XML is in. I'm going to use the word schema because that's what all the kids are using today. And all I mean by a schema, or any of those other terms, is the kind of dictionary that's used to define what tags are used in the content. The schema determines what tags are valid to be in an XML document and also describes what they mean. So in one schema, if we're rendering a paragraph, we might use just a P. That's what's used in HTML. But in another schema, paragraphs might be represented by the letters P-A-R-A. They both happen to mean paragraphs. It's easy to change from one to the other. And the choice of schema is really just affecting this vocabulary. So here I've highlighted 6 schemas that are used fairly commonly in marking up text, especially sort of human-generated text. I'm not going to go into all of these in great detail, but when you hear people talking about them, when you're evaluating them for your projects, just remember that they're all XML, and that if you pick one, it is probably possible to change to another one if you need to. So just as a quick overview, I'm going to just highlight which of those schemas are applicable for what types of content you may have. And this is not a hard and fast rule, and there are many, many others. These are just the ones that are most common right now. I'm most familiar with book and scholarly content, so ones that you'll hear quite often in that space are going to be TEI, which is one of probably the most difficult and complex schemas. But for some trade books, you'll be hearing a lot about EPUB, which is a fairly simple schema. And DAISY is a highly accessible schema and is now required for a lot of educational content that publishers may be trying to put into the educational space. DAISY is a format that you're going to encounter. I'm less familiar with magazines and newspapers, but Metzalto and Prism are both being taken up right now with a lot of popularity. I believe Prism is useful for content that has a lot of multimedia associated with it, and I think it tends to be used with magazines. There's also an option to create your own schema. I think this isn't done as often anymore as it used to be, and there's some good reasons for that. It's not something I really recommend to publishers anymore, except in some fairly rare cases. I won't spend too much time on this, but creating your own schema is essentially going to be more expensive and will impede your ability to reuse that content and will make it more difficult for you to find qualified people to either encode in it or work with it. Now, as I said before, there are some schemas like TEI that are fairly complex, and then there are simpler ones like EPUB. And so then you have a kind of standard trade-off where if you may have a more complex schema, it's going to cost more, but it will give you more flexibility later. So a quick example there, TEI has a large vocabulary for describing places. So with something like TEI, you could tell your vendor that every time the name of a city or a street or a place occurs in the text, make sure you mark that up appropriately. And they'll do that, and that will be fairly expensive. But now if you want to create some kind of geographic-based application out of that content, let's say very simply you want to put up a Google map and show all the points on the map where characters in that work have visited. If you have that encoded in the document, it should take a developer just a couple days to throw together some kind of mapping application. Maybe you want to distribute something like that on a portable device like an iPhone and let people walk around a city and explore locations that have occurred in a book. Again, that will be, you'll already have that information available if you have taken the time to encode it. But given how expensive that is, it's also perfectly okay to start with a simple format, and when you want to build a specific application, then you go back and do some retagging just for the specific data that you need. So that's all our XML content, and after this I'm going to just show some quick examples of what can be done with digital documents. This would be another good break time for questions.
Yeah, we have a couple questions. Some claim that EPUB is not XML, but rather XHTML. Is that correct? And maybe if you could also just explain what XHTML is.
Okay, sure. Well, XHTML is XML. That's what the X stands for. It's essentially a flavor of HTML that conforms to XML rules. So if you know anything about HTML at all, you probably know everything you need to know about XHTML. The differences between the two are very technical and very slight. EPUB is composed of both XHTML for the content. You can also use DAISY. And then EPUB includes a number of different XML files which are used for metadata. So EPUB is really not itself one schema. It's composed of many different schemas. Now the reason the reason I was calling it very simple is that XHTML is fairly simple. It is more of what we would call a presentational schema. It tells you more about how the document should look. It's not as much of a semantic schema that tells you about what it means. TEI and DocBook are more on the semantic end, where they're meant to encode both the presentational layout of that document, but also, again, like things like place names, like what the words in the document actually mean. So EPUB is going to be most useful for documents in which you're only really concerned with their presentation, and fiction is a good example there.
Okay, we've got an interesting question here. I want to create XML files in-house. Can you recommend a good XML editor for book publishing?
The ones I run into the most, Oxygen is very popular in the academic space. The people who make Oxygen have a number of different products that are geared to different levels of XML expertise. They make, I've just started playing with a product of theirs called Author, which is their most simple one, and that's probably where I would recommend starting. They all do encourage you to know something about XML syntax, but it tries to hide a lot of the scary parts and be as user-friendly as possible. That's the one I'm really most familiar with.
This is a good general question that I think touches on some of the core clarification issues. But this question, is XML the same as metadata?
Oh, that is a good question. They're kind of two different, well, metadata is a concept, and XML often includes metadata as well as the content that the metadata is describing. Depending on the type of data format you're talking about, metadata may or may not be in XML. In the case of EPUB, it is. There are other forms of metadata, such as MARC records or other kinds of somewhat older library formats that are metadata that can be associated with documents that aren't themselves XML. It certainly is helpful, especially on the web, if your metadata is in XML, but it doesn't have to be. In any kind of structured format that is well understood, it can easily be converted to XML if it's something that you need.
Okay, this looks like a good place to progress. We have some other questions, but again, we can loop back to some of these during the Q&A component, and perhaps we'll have some additional time as we're going through.
Okay. So, assuming that that you've done the right thing and you've gotten as far as XML, if you remember from the original diagram here, there are some arrows going off into space. And what I'm just going to close with here are some discussions about what you can do from the point of XML. And because it's what I'm most familiar with, I'm going to be concentrating on putting your content onto the web. So a kind of, I'm going to call Web 1.0 way of thinking about content distribution is a kind of top-down publisher push view where you have your content, you have some web properties that you either control or you have a relationship with, and you push your content out to that. It could be your publisher website that maybe you're not putting the text of the book on, but you're going to automatically publish out a list of your titles. You may have an agreement with an author that allows them to embed some or all of their content onto their personal website so that they can do their own promotion. Or if you're in the academic space, you may have an agreement with one or more publishing platforms where you syndicate your content to be put on a platform that is accessible to libraries and universities. A kind of Web 1.5 idea is to start to consider more how people will discover your content. The most obvious one is Google. These days it's so important to get content discoverable by search engines. Search engines are increasingly the main way that people interact with the web. And if you attended the SEO webcast, you heard some examples of why that's important and the value in capturing the audience that's interested in your properties and directing them towards websites that you control. And then, of course, there's social media now where there are opportunities to leverage a lot of sort of book-driven fan sites where there's an opportunity for people to begin talking about your content if you provide easy ways for them to link to those from social media sites, especially important in the educational space. That's really great and provides another way for people to discover your content other than just plain search. But I want to encourage people to really think about true Web 2.0 concepts such as user-generated content. You'll notice here that the arrow goes both directions. UGC is really about thinking of ways in which people can remix or reuse your content. It does involve a certain amount of giving up of control. It usually means that you're going to put out for reuse content in a way that allows a certain amount of flexibility. But the advantage is that you can essentially outsource a lot of product development to your readers or your fans or an academic community. So I'm just going to highlight some 3 quick examples of fairly recent work that I think are all some interesting ways to reuse electronic content. The first one is a very, very tiny publisher here in Massachusetts called Small Beer Press. They have gotten rights from some of their authors to license their content under a Creative Commons license. This means that it's still under copyright, but people have the right to distribute, modify, and make some changes to the work as long as they cite the original source. And what Small Beer is doing, as a tiny publisher, they don't have a lot of resources for digital distribution. So on their website, they put up these books in whatever format is most convenient for them. I think they offer PDF and plain text. And they let their readers convert those formats into their own favorite ebook format. If a reader has a Kindle, there are many tools to convert from plain text to PDF into the Kindle format. And once you've done that, you can send it back to Small Beer and they'll put it on their website. Or you can put it on your own website. That's all allowed under the Creative Commons license. So that's a really simple way with limited resources to put your work out in a variety, sometimes a dozen ebook formats without having to do any work yourself or pay to have that conversion done. The second site, which hasn't launched yet, despite a big New York Times article a few weeks ago, is called Cookster. And it is going to be an attempt to aggregate recipes from a number of different, a number of different printed cookbooks. And they're really going after the fairly substantial number of hundreds of thousands of free recipes. Their idea is that people will find value in professional recipes that have essentially been curated by publishers and have undergone testing. And of course, being a Web 2.0 site, missing some vowels, they're going to encourage user participation as well. It'll just sort of be interesting to see how that turns out, given that they're really tackling this so-called problem of free information, if they're able to provide more value than the thousands of recipe sites that are already out there. And the last project, which is very cool, sponsored by the Institute for the Future of the Book and done by APT, is a kind of close reading of Doris Lessing's The Golden Notebook. The entire text of the book is available online in a very attractive hand-designed user interface. They have selected a number of readers to provide commentary and annotations for the work, and they invite discussion about it from the larger community. So I just think that's in contrast to something like Small Beer, which is really all about crowdsourcing and letting other people do it. There's also room for some very lovingly crafted work that uses the full text, I think, in a way that's very compelling. So that is all the planned material we have. We did want to leave a lot of time for questions.
Well, we do have some questions that added up as we went along, so maybe we can hit those first. And if folks want to continue to submit questions as we go along, we'll try to take some of those. I realize we're up against the clock here, too. So maybe if we do another 10 minutes or so, Liza, would that work for you?
That's perfectly fine.
Okay. So we'll be here for about another 10 minutes. If questions come in, we can try to incorporate those, but I want to get through some of the questions that have already been submitted. This is one that I find very interesting, and I think I already know the answer to this, but any insider news or gossip of whether the Kindle will adopt EPUB with its next generation?
Oh, I wish I knew. I think it's very likely, but they're a very close company, and it's not even clear when there'll be a next Kindle, or if they do have EPUB support, I don't know whether that will apply to the Kindle One or only the later version. I really hope they do, though.
Yeah, and the Sony reader has it, right?
Yes, both the 505 and the new 700.
I had a question in regards to video. Can you embed video clips in an ebook text using EPUB? Are there better programs for embedding video clips in an ebook text?
So EPUB has a kind of interesting design where they want to accommodate interesting multimedia work, but they also want EPUB to remain a very accessible format. So the basic approach that the EPUB specification requires is that you can embed any kind of file format that you would like. And what I would always recommend is that you embed it in your EPUB XHTML in the same way that you might embed video in a website. But what EPUB will require is that if you include multimedia, that you always have what's called a fallback document. That it's in one of the more straightforward, simple formats that EPUB supports natively. So the idea is that if you're viewing a document that has an embedded movie, the EPUB spec will require that you add a fallback of maybe a text transcript of the movie that could include images like still captures from it. So in theory, it's unrestricted what you can include in an EPUB, but the spec will require that you provide some kind of alternative format that can be downgraded for either simpler readers or that's very accessible.
I had a question in regards to schemas. Which schemas are low in complexity and which are high?
The ones that I cited, I would say that that EPUB is going to be an example of the most simple. Some of the metadata that is encoded in DAISY is fairly straightforward. I don't know as much about the newspaper and magazine formats. Of the complex ones, both DocBook and TEI can still be used to encode some fairly simple documents. You don't have to use all of the thousands of tags that are in those schemas. And I've used TEI and DocBook both for very simple documents. So the complexity really comes more in the learning curve and being intimidated by the volumes of documentation. But the documents themselves can be fairly simple in either of those complex schemas.
Here's one about EPUB and DRM. What is the difference between EPUB natively and DRM EPUB?
Well, the EPUB spec doesn't define any particular kind of digital rights management. It does allow it. So they really are leaving that up to the individual vendors to define what kind of DRM they'll either accept, or if you're using a creation tool, what kind of DRM it'll output. As far as I know, only Adobe really has a DRM scheme for EPUB, and hopefully not too many people will take that any further, since it's not something that I'm personally fond of. But it is allowed, and there are DRM EPUBs being produced, but I think Adobe is really the only vendor that's pushing that right now.
Could you touch on the process of creating XML files in-house versus using a vendor? I know that's kind of an open-ended question. So if we end up answering that question and the folks who asked it need some clarification, please go ahead and submit that through the chat window.
Well, a lot of these days, a lot of modern tools, I know including Adobe InDesign, can output different forms of XML directly. So sometimes, especially for fiction content that's going to be encoded mostly using presentational tags, I think you can often get away with knowing very little about XML as long as you're working with some editorial tools that are fairly recent. Even things like Word or OpenOffice can output some kinds of XML, although they're not really designed for that. XML is not, certainly from a programmer standpoint, it's not very hard to learn. So I think a lot of publishers have IT staff that could ultimately be trained in XML. Those would be good people to participate in one of these digitization projects if you need a technical resource. It won't take long to get a good IT person up to speed.
Question here about Web 2.0, and this sounds more like prognosticating well into the future, so we won't hold you to this, Liza. But do you anticipate a Web 2.0 application growing, for example, an interactive component involving the reader and then developing other documents based on reader involvement, such as Wikipedia? Sounds like kind of like a living organism type application.
It does sound very interesting. Most of the kind of document reading platforms that are coming out right now are really coming from the educational space, and just really in the last few months I've seen some really good work coming out of that uses both kind of like library and metadata sensibilities, but a more Web 2.0 kind of approach to both design and user interface. So if I were going to look towards what kind of applications I expect to come out, I would really look at what people are doing in the library and educational space. I think trade publishers are a little bit slower, except for some of these experiments like the Digital Notebook project. And they're certainly less ambitious. I see a lot more works that are specific to one book or to one marketing campaign rather than these kind of larger platforms that the academic world seems interested in.
What do you recommend for storing XML?
Well, I guess I'm not totally sure what storing would mean. If you have a lot of XML, there are databases that are designed for XML-based search and can transform the XML into HTML or other formats that you might need. Those are certainly databases that I've used on these kind of online reference products where you have sometimes gigabytes of XML that make up a dictionary or an encyclopedia. I don't think most trade publishers at this point have enough XML that they really need to manage. As I said, it's just plain text. So storing it as a zip file or in a series of folders will scale pretty well up until you get into the tens of thousands of documents. At that point, you might want to look into an XML database.
We're just about finished here, so we've got a couple questions in regards to schema, and I think that might be a good place to wrap it up. First is, when and why would it be more feasible to create your own schema versus using an existing one?
When that has come up, it's generally been from the academic world where a very specialized search product has been developed. So in cases where you want to support a kind of very researcher-driven advanced search where you have different fields for not just maybe title, but a place where a person was born or range of dates in which some event occurred. If you have content that's going to need a very specialized vocabulary, then that's a place where a unique schema design is often advisable. That said, schemas like TEI are really evolved and have been in use for sometimes a decade or more. And I think these days there just aren't going to be as many cases where your content is so unique that there isn't some other schema that can accommodate it. And any XML schema is by nature extensible. So if your content has just really one or two unique features, then I always suggest finding a schema that's closest and just adding the small feature set that you need rather than making up a whole new one from scratch.
And along those lines, in our last question today, how difficult is it to adapt an existing schema?
It's always easy to go from a more complex schema to a less complex schema. So in that earlier example with I used with TEI and encoding places, if you have TEI that is very expressive and has a large number of semantic tags, and all you want to do is change that into maybe a very metadata-focused schema that just has title, author, and maybe a short summary. There you're going from a high level of complexity to a low level of detail, and that's very straightforward. What is difficult is kind of like injecting complexity where it doesn't exist. So if you had content in EPUB, essentially just in XHTML, and you want to convert it into something like TEI, you could do that, but you would end up with a kind of very flavorless TEI. It wouldn't tell you anything about the semantics of the document because that information wasn't available in the EPUB version that you started with. But what is common when people need to make that conversion is that they do an extra step of someone going into that converted TEI and adding the semantic information that you may want. But just converting from one to another for the sake of, because maybe you need to interface with another system that accepts a different schema, that's usually not too difficult. It's only where you want to add tags or add information that was missing before where you're going to need some human intervention.
Well, I think that's a good place to wrap things up. Liza, thank you very much for doing this today, and thanks to all for participating. Just wanted to invite everybody to stop by the TOC blog at toc.o'reilly.com, and our conference is coming up in February. And also please keep an eye out for future webcasts. We have one coming up on December 3rd. So thank you very much. Catherine, I don't know if you have any wrap-up stuff you want to do, but from my end, I appreciate everybody coming out today.
Yes, thank you very much.
Oh, and I want to say thank you both to you, Mac, and to Liza. That was a fascinating presentation. I think everyone found it useful. And to everyone who joined us today, thank you. And I wanted to say we do have a recording of this available. It'll be available in a few days, and we'll send you an email as soon as it's ready. So if you missed any, you can catch that. And we also have a short post-event survey. You're not required to take it, but we very much appreciate your feedback. So if you want to take the time, we appreciate it. And thank you, everyone.